At one stage, I was very depressed after Korea, not because of Korea, although I was appalled at our inefficiency. The army was not efficient in Korea. We seem to have learnt nothing from the Second World War, in my view. And so when I joined the Queen's in Germany, we were very much under strength. That depressed me. In Korea, we were inefficient and under strength, although we were at war. And if I hadn't been wounded, I think I probably would have left the army. But I was wounded and came home and spent the best part of a year in and out of the Cambridge Hospital just down the road here at Aldershot. And then the decision was, am I going to stay? And of course, because of my wounds, I shouldn't have been allowed to stay in the infantry. And at one stage they said, you can't, or physically you won't be fit enough. The moment they said that, the decision was made for me. I'm going to stay. And so I did. But I think the hardest part was I going to stay in the army? That was the hardest decision I've ever had to make. There were lots of others, of course. I don't think we learnt very much from the Second World War. The army I joined was appallingly badly equipped. We didn't have a self-propelled artillery gun. We didn't have an armoured personnel carrier. We had a rifle that was the same as they'd used virtually in the First World War. We had a slow-firing machine gun. Our tactics were based on the drill book almost. There was no flexibility. And it took us, and national service didn't help because it was a sausage machine. They came in, they did their year or their 18 months, and you couldn't progress in training. You were just doing the same things over and over again, not able to develop tactics and thought and so on. So it was a very frustrating time until national service finished. But having said that, it was national servicemen who went to Korea. It was national servicemen in the Malayan emergency, and they did superbly well. And of course, you went in Korea, by the time I got there, it was a static war. We had advanced, then we'd been pushed back by the Chinese, then we'd gone up again to where the war had started on the 38th parallel, and we dug in there and we stayed there. So we were back to almost a 1914-18 war type, so tactics didn't really matter much. Again, this is one of the reasons I was so depressed. I mean, I was in a time warp almost, and it wasn't my idea of soldiering at all. Because I was wounded, I wasn't fit enough to go to Malaya, so I can't really speak for that. But the army lurched from one crisis to the next, really. I mean, Suez, Malaya, Kenya, we call it peacekeeping now. We called it counterinsurgency in those days. And so it was a very difficult period for the army. And it then became a war rather like the First World War. We were in trenches. We didn't move forward or back. We only moved sideways or back into reserve for a couple of weeks or something like that. But even then we were still within shell and mortar range. And it was very boring, 95% boredom, and the other 5% you were terrified. We did a lot of patrolling towards the Chinese to find out what was going on, to ambush patrols, try and capture prisoners. You were going in and out through minefields. And when you were on these patrols, they were very frightening, there's no doubt about it. The soldiers hated it, and the officers did as well. My platoon ran into most of a Chinese company that were trying to advance up the side of a hill. And we were just getting into an ambush position. And there was a very short, sharp firefight with lots of grenades being thrown. And I got part of, presumably a Chinese grenade, down my right-hand side. It might have been a British one for all I know. And 2 bullets from a Burke gun, a small machine gun in my right leg, which smashed it. And I was actually out there for 9 hours before most of my platoon, 1 man was killed, 1 was captured, and the rest of us were wounded. And some of them managed to get back, and they eventually, after 9 hours, rescue parties came out and they managed to get us back under a misty, foggy morning. And I went back. We were actually mortared on the way back, and the chaps who were carrying the stretcher dropped it to take cover, and I rolled down a bank, which probably did me more harm than the initial bullets had. Anyway, I was then lifted out by helicopter, went back to a MASH, as in the television series, and there they took a couple of bullets out of my leg, which had lodged there, and I can vaguely remember a hand coming out and these 2 small bullets, and the chap saying, "We've taken these out of you." And then back to an evacuation hospital in Seoul, American again, and then flown out from there to a British military hospital in Japan. And suddenly over the radio came a message saying there's trouble in the Diamond. So I drove straight to the Diamond to find a huge stone-throwing, bottle-throwing mob, Catholics and Protestants against each other. And Mr. Hume, John Hume, was there. And I drove straight into the middle of it and found him. And he said, "Major, you better get people here, get some more troops here. This is getting out of control." And he stood on the top of my Land Rover and appealed to them to disperse, and they wouldn't. And in fact, I think there was occasion, yes, when a Protestant had been kicked to death, and so there were pretty angry people around. And I stood in the middle with John Hume, and suddenly they all stopped throwing everything to listen to Hume and the British Army Major with his Land Rover. And then suddenly they came from both sides, and I got hit on the head with I'm not sure whether it was the bottle on the head and a stone on my hand or the other way around. Anyway, I ended up in a pool of blood on the floor, which taught me a lesson: never go between a Catholic and a Protestant crowd. And anyway, I had got a message back to battalion headquarters, and at least 1, if not 2 companies came marching to the rescue, and the crowd eventually dispersed, and I was patched up, and it wasn't serious anyway. But I did appear, I think, on the Daily Mirror, on the front page, in fact, with blood all over my face and so on. Distinctly, my children were about to go back to boarding school, to a convent. My wife rang up for them to say goodbye to Daddy. And at that precise moment, there was an Ulster bus outside the window which had been hijacked by a screaming mob of Catholics who were threatening to burn it unless, I don't know what, unless something. I mean, you couldn't tell. I remember they had this awful thing, when you kill a British soldier, clap your hands, and they were all singing that. And it was a thoroughly nasty thing, and I had to pretend to my little daughters that there was nothing untoward going on while that was happening. They couldn't hear it, of course.
And then likewise in Jerusalem, you said you went, that was obviously peacekeeping duties for the main force.
Well, really, although again we didn't, there was the Palestine police, of course, who were the civilian powers there. The military were there, of course, to stop, again, vulnerable points getting attacked by the Israelis. The difficulty of Greece was, when we first went there, I think you were allowed out in 2s, armed at all times, and eventually I think you had to go out in 4s. One of at least had to carry a sort of a Sten gun or a Thompson submachine gun, because the Provo Corps we were armed with pistols. We didn't have, in the prisons, we didn't have the normal sort of weaponry. They were just hand pistols, Smith & Wessons, 38 Smith & Wessons and things like that. And the ordinary either Stens or, as I say, Thompson submachine guns, but they always had to be 4 of you to go walking out into the old town. Now, in the old town, you always felt reasonably comfortable because it was mainly at that time mostly Arabic. And the Arabs were sort of fairly friendly towards us, where the Israelis were getting a bit stroppy with us. But of course, if you go back to 1937, it was the other way round. It was the Arabs that were giving us stick, and the Israelis were friendly towards us. Very peculiar political situation there, of course. Because the mandate was given to us in 1919, wasn't it? I seem to remember in well, I don't remember it, but I mean the mandate was given to us in 1919 after the First War, when the Middle East, of course, was split up mainly between France and Britain, really. I mean, Lebanese was French, Syria, I think, was French, Jordan was British, I say British, but mandated British anyway. And then Jordan became independent kingdom, a peaceful independent as it is today. But frankly, when you went out, you just kept your head down and minded your own business. There were various YMCAs in the town, in the city of Jerusalem itself, where they're quite well guarded, so you could go in there for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and a cake and all the rest of it. But you didn't spend time out in restaurants or anything like that.
Then we went back to Surrey and Garrison. From there, then we left for the emergency up into Malaya again, where our HQ was at Tamimi, and the various companies were in various areas of Malaya, which I can't remember the actual place where we stayed, but it was only on a small rubber plantation where we used to patrol round the rubber plantations, because the communist terrorists would go after the rubber tappers, which were mainly Tamils out there, doing the rubber tapping getting the latex from the trees, and they used to petrify them. Terrorists used to petrify them for food and anything they could get, on clothing or anything they can get hold of. So we used to patrol that, and then we used to do it could be anything from 4 days. If you were going out for 4 days, jungle patrolling, then you would take 4 days' rations, which were built up with mainly tinned food, tinned corned beef, tinned bacon, sardines, and then you had like tinned potatoes and things like that, which you used to have to cook on a little Tommy stove. But when we went out into the jungle, as I say, we'd take 4 days' rations. And then if it came to it, if we were going to stay in longer than 4 days, we would take an airdrop. So we used to take these airdrops, and you could indent for certain things. Like your jungle boots, you only used to catch them on a thorn or something like that, and they would tear quite easily, especially your clothing would tear, so you would indent for that as well. Jungle patrolling, we used to do it what they call fan search. You would make a base, and then a section you would say north, east, south and west. So one section would go out north and one section would go out east. 2 sections would stay in base. Then the following day, the 2 sections, one would go out south and the other one would go out west. And you would patrol for about 2 or 3 hours. I mean, say in the jungle it was quite thick in places. You couldn't see, and the distance wasn't very clear. So therefore you could get ambushed quite easily. You never sort of kept to tracks or anything like that. You just plough your way through. Half the time you leave your hat behind, you know, because it got caught on thorns and things. Animals didn't used to worry us. Didn't see many of them. We always had Borneo trackers with us, and they would do up front just to pick up any tracks of communists. Occasionally we come across a camp that had been disused. We did come across one. They must have heard us coming because they fled quite quickly. They knew the back of the jungle like we know Piccadilly Circus. Then I got demobbed in the end of June. I had quite a bit of leave due to me. Then when August back, and then Suez started up, and as I was doing 3 years with the colours and 4 on reserve, August Bank Holiday Monday, which always fell then on the first Monday of August, a telegram shot through the door. Would I report immediately to Connaught Barracks, Dover, Royal Fusiliers? So next day I jumped on the train, went down to Dover, and I thought, oh my Lord, it's all over, all started all over again. The trucks were outside, waiting to pick us up. They were all painted sand colour. They took us to Connaught Barracks, and you've never seen such a rabble in all your life. There again, I was in 8 Platoon C Company, and we were nearly all reservists. They tried to put us on guard one night. You never saw such a shower in all your life. We didn't blanco, we didn't pull our boots up. The orderly officer come to inspect us, and he just turned around and he said, "March 'em off, Sergeant." He just couldn't be bothered with us. And then we were at Dover for about a fortnight, and then there was but I thought it was a good idea to take us down to Salisbury, to Bulford. What a place. We were under canvas. We had to have palliasses stuffed with straw on duck boards, and they used to try, our company commander thought it would be a good idea to do night exercises on Salisbury Plains, where they used to take us out at night, and my section, we used to lose the company and find the nearest pub. We spend half the evening in a pub and then try and join up with the company. But that was okay. And then we came back to Dover. I think we were down at Salisbury for about a fortnight. And we went back to Dover. And then the word came that we were to embark for Egypt. We went down to Southampton and boarded the New Australia. We sailed for Egypt, but nothing was really happening then. We didn't know if we were going in or not. Anyhow, we got as far as Malta, and we laid off Malta. Though we didn't land, we laid off, waiting instructions. And then the instructions came through that from Sir Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister then, said, right, go. So we sailed for the Suez. I think it was HMS Bulwark. She went out there. Several destroyers went. I couldn't remember their name. But they did some barrage. And then the paratroopers, they went in first. There was the Royal Fusiliers, the Royal West Kents. I can't remember the other regiment. But anyhow, the paratroopers went in and they went up, went through Port Said, and they drove the Egyptians back as far as Alcantara. We came up behind and we dug in at Alcantara, right alongside the Suez Canal and the railway. And we dug in there for about 2.5 weeks. And then the United Nations, they came by train down. They took over our lines. The Egyptians were about 500 yards, and we had a United Nations lorry parked right in the middle of us. So we had the Egyptians 500 yards, and then we had Royal Fusiliers with this United Nations lorry with its United Nations flags flying in between us. So nobody really had a go at each other. Then we went back into Port Said and we took over a technical college. It was the barracks. Cool, what a place that was. And we used to go round Port Said looking for Egyptian troops. We used to go in one or two of the houses, or we went in. The family had fled. One bungalow we went into, he must have been an officer, because on the floor when we went in was an officer's uniform. So he either got out of that and became a civilian, nobody knows. But they never seem to clear up, because when they bombed, the destroyers sent over shells and that to start with, they killed a lot of cattle. And though we were up in the in Kantara for about 2.5 weeks, we came back, nobody cleared the cattle up. They were still lying in the streets.
Some of the patrols lasted up to about 10, 12 days. Some went up to 21 days, depending on whether you were following up a contact. And it was quite the actual, like the weather being ever so humid and hot. And you could go into the jungle with a new set of clothing. After 20 days you come out and it's rotting off your body. So it was quite a environment that's vulnerable to be in. And the jungle itself, when you first go in, the noise is what you first notice, with all the insects and the noise that's going on. Quite a noisy environment to be in. And also, it takes a lot of getting used to as a new person going into the jungle. But when you've been in there for quite a while, 2 or 3 months or so, you'll get used to it, and it goes into the background, and you don't start worrying about the creepy crawlies and the different things that are in the jungle. And you also found that there was a lot of comradeship. When you were actually on active service in the jungle, you found that your mates and your colleagues were all pulling their weight, playing ball, and we all looked after each other. I did have on 2 occasions where we found some food and tins and cans in the jungle, and we were following it up, and we did actually make contact. When you actually open fire, and normally there's not a return of fire, the terrorists disperse in all directions, and sometimes you were able that you did catch a couple, other times that the majority, say there was 6 or 7, you might get 2 and the remainder had gone. Another time I remember getting caught in an ambush, which the actual terrorists were ambushing us, and which was rather a nasty time. But over my whole tour, I would have said about on 3-4 occasions did I get actual contact. At that time, yes, it's a hairy situation, but your training takes over straight away and you sort of get control of it. You might try and bury yourself in the ground for the first few seconds, and then your training takes over and you handle it quite well.
We operated as independent companies, and so it was a strange situation because for 3 years there would be officers in the regiment who you actually never met. And I've met some now, recently, playing golf, who said, oh, we were in the One Queen's together in Malaya. And I never met him because he was in a different company and we were miles, 50, 60, 100 miles apart, and only appeared at battalion headquarters maybe once or twice a month when we were dispatched to go and collect the pay. But the operations were, I suppose, 95% on a guessing basis. We just patrolled as a platoon, split up into small parties of small groups of 3 or 4, and just fanning and covering the jungle looking for signs of terrorists. And that was how it worked. We'd go into the jungle for maybe 2 weeks if we weren't going to if we were carrying our food, and we could actually survive for 2 weeks without resupply, which was quite difficult with the army issue ration pack, most of which got discarded. And we would just hope to find something. Now, very occasionally, we would find a camp, mostly unoccupied. There was one occasion when I was very fortunate, when I had a young officer with me under instruction called Foster, and he and I were at the head of the platoon, and we came over a rock and came face to face with a group of Chinese terrorists. Michael Foster actually shot the first chap, who turned out to be the equivalent to a brigadier, immediately, from about 3 yards range, straight through the head. As we ran through the camp, I grabbed his hat, which I have to this day in my study. I was fired at by his bodyguard, who missed with the first round. Unfortunately, his Tommy gun jammed with the second. We hit him and then captured him wounded. Unfortunately, he died before we could get him out of the jungle, which was very thick at the time. So that was a lucky operation. It wasn't on information, we just came across it. Personally, I loved it. I was, of course, young and unmarried. You had an exciting job to do. You knew you could do it well or you could do it badly. You were undoubtedly frightened at times. I do remember one occasion when we were told there was an ambush set up for us and we had to go and find it. Well, the only way to find it was to walk into it. And that was scary. And people say, oh, so-and-so's a brave man. Nobody's a brave man. My biggest fear was to be considered a coward by my soldiers. Therefore, you do brave things because you're frightened of being thought to be a coward. I remember that particularly. And it was possible to go for up to 14 days with what you carried. Now, that was pretty rough, and you weren't using any of the army rations. You took some rice, some dried thing called ikan bilis in Malaya, which is a dried fish. That was probably not very good for the health, but you could survive. But by and large, we used to go out carrying 6 days' rations. Now, 6 24-hour packs simply don't begin to fit into even the biggest Bergen if you take the whole thing, and we didn't have Bergens. So the first thing was we binned most of it. Each ration pack had 3 packets of biscuits. That went straight into the wastepaper basket in the basher before we set off. We kept out the things that we liked and were prepared to eat, and not the rest of the stuff. And it was fairly rough. we would supplement it, if we could, with things we'd find: monkeys, snakes, tortoises. Even once we came across a wild pig in an Iban, in a Aborigine trap. That was a great luxury. But you could supplement it, and sometimes in the bigger rivers even fish. But I remember coming out of the jungle once and was sent for by the CO because there was a conference in Kuala Lumpur at headquarters Malaya Command to decide on the contents of the ration pack of the future. A new one was being designed from locally purchased products, apparently. So I went up to this conference. There were about 40 people at this conference. I think I was the only one who had ever been into the jungle. It was full of staff officers and ordnance experts and doctors. And I said the sort of things I've just said. I said, we've got to go in there for 14 days, or perhaps 7 days, carrying it. It's no good producing these frightfully smart things with all the calories you need if you can't physically lift it. And they said, but this pack we're designing is no greater than the 24-hour pack that you're issued with now. And I said, yes, and 90% of that 24-hour pack goes into the waste paper basket in the barrack room before we go out. It's not eaten, so there's no point in having it because it's heavy and we can't cope with it. And I remember particularly a very senior doctor, he was probably a colonel, getting extremely angry, saying that's absolutely almost a court-martial offence. He said, you need all the calories in this ration pack. It is specifically designed. I said, fine, you've got to make it lighter. But that was the attitude. And then we went up to Brunswick, where the East Surreys were, for a 4-day bash, sports, drinking, dinners, balls and science mess, to meet our future partners. And that was a brilliant idea of the two COs, David Lloyd-Aon on our part and Colonel Clive Wallace, erstwhile Irish Rugby International, who commanded these Surreys. And we had a most wonderful time. We got to know each other, and that, to my mind, set up what was an extremely successful amalgamation. First of all, we were expected to disregard the German police. If we were, and I remember being summoned for driving at 60 miles an hour round the Schillerplatz, which is a town square in Iserlohn, and just telling the German that I was to do what I liked. German police, it was ridiculous. But also on the social life, we weren't allowed to fraternise. Well, I was an unmarried young officer, and unmarried young officers want one thing in their social life, and there weren't too many English ones around. And I remember meeting this lovely German girl in a pub on one Rosenmontag, and we had a very nice relationship, which was totally illegal. And I remember saying to her parents, who I met on a number of occasions, and they were very much educated people, saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I simply can't invite your daughter back to my home, my officer's mess. And they said, John, we fully understand the situation, and we're delighted to have your company, and I'm delighted you enjoy the company of our daughter. And we fully understand. But I still think back to how dreadful that was. Maybe there were people around who'd suffered in the hands of the Germans who took a totally opposite view to me, but that was my view, and it still is.
Life on the troop ship below deck was very hard because although they'd no longer used hammocks, we had these bunk beds which were 5 high, and in very rough weather, if you were living on the bottom bunk and 4 of your colleagues above you were seasick, you can imagine what it was like catching it at the bottom. I never stayed below very long because I found it was even worse staying below. So I used to go up on top as much as I could, get a lot of fresh air. But I also used to play a lot of 3-card brag. And one of my famed claims is that we were the only school left going around the Bay of Biscay playing 3-card brag. Everybody else was below being sick. And we had such a big school and so much money on the table, we didn't notice it was rough. So we carried on playing our 3-card brag until the storm was over. Another aspect, social life, is the regimental band used to play regularly in the bar at night, and we used to have great fun and games there because there was not a lot to do, although we did a lot of our room jobs, if you like, on the deck, organised by the ship's crew. We used to have to scrub the decks and do various things like that. we did exercises and all the other things that the officers tried to keep us occupied whilst they were, in between their social activities and mess nights. We also used to, at ports, we used to bring on board a man called the Gully Gully Man, particularly in Suez, where he was a magician, and I was fascinated how he used to take half-crown pieces off people in the audience and then just go to somebody's ear and produce a one-day-old chicken from the half-crown. That always used to fascinate me. Another pastime was that during the trip through the Suez Canal, the Walla Walla boats used to come alongside and throw up a big ball of raffia, which had a rope on the end and a basket in below, and in the basket were their electrical goods like watches and various things like that. And the ploy was the soldiers used to take the watch, throw the raffia bag back down, and not put any money in the thing. And some of the incensed Walla Walla men used to manage to climb up and get on board. And on one occasion, one of them was thrown overboard because they wouldn't give him his money. So it was quite an interesting. And as a young man in those days, I found that also very fascinating. I then was tasked to run the 432 heat trials in a place called Bir Fukum on the Little Aden Peninsula. And we were given these 2 prototype 432s, having never seen them and never driven them before. And we had to drive them for 10 hours a day in the desert. And I had 3 national service with me, and I've since caught up with one of them. And we drove, 2 of us drove for 5 hours in the morning, kept them running over at lunchtime, the other 2 drove for 5 hours in the afternoon. And it was amazing. We went out on the salt flats for miles away from base with no telecommunications or anything. And I recall one time we broke down, and I was on my own. The other one was elsewhere, and I completely broke down, couldn't get things started. And I remember seeing an Aden protected levy patrol further back, so I grabbed my goatskin water bottle and marched back, following the tracks back to where I'd seen this patrol, and eventually found it in the desert. And there was 2 SAS men with me, and they organised 2 4-tonners to come and tow me and give me a bum start. Got going again. It was quite frightening being on your own. Once we'd completed the heat trials on the vehicles, we then had troop trials, and we drove around in 135 in the shade, battled down with the troops in the back. The night before, we'd built 2 assault courses, identical, so that the boffins that were out testing the troop trials could monitor the performance of these people who'd driven around in these vehicles for 2 hours, battled down in the heat. We drove up, reversed up to where the 2 assault courses that we built the night before were, opened the doors, and the troops were running down this completely flat piece of sand, whooping and screaming and hollering, saying this is the easiest assault course we've ever been on because the Arabs had stolen the whole lot, barbed wire and all. So it was quite an amusing incident. We had to stop the trials and rebuild and guard the assault courses overnight whilst we did the trials again.
Well, we didn't change, you see, because it was just a battalion renaming itself to something else. And, we had a parade on the 31st of December 1966 on the square at Munster, where one, said, I'm not sure whether we sort of lay down your arm, the 1st Battalion of the Queen's Surrey lay down your arms, and then 1st Battalion of the Queen's Regiment take up your arms. And at the same time, Les Wilson, who was there, had arranged the flags of the battalion to be sort of run down and run up and so on. And there was a message from the Colonel-in-Chief, and we sort of gave 3 cheers for her, and then we had a march past actually our local brigadier, who was someone I knew very well and who had actually been one of our supporting gunners in Italy, so a chap called John Douglas Withers. And that was it. But we were still the same battalion, but we had another name, and one made that clear that our philosophies and our way of practice wasn't changed. The only problem, to some extent, was that one acquired even more colonels of the regiment to look after. And I think at the end of my time, I totted them up. I think there were 11 people who had either been or were sort of connected with the regiment, from General John Whitfield, who had been the last colonel of the Queen's Royal Regiment, Brigadier George Ruppel, the East Surrey Regiment, John Metcalfe, General Francis Piggott, and so on and so forth. And then we had a new colonel, General Dick Craddock of the Queen's Regiment. So that side was a bit difficult to keep them all informed and so on. But actually on the ground it didn't make any difference. One just put on a new cap badge and slightly different, wore different tie some of the time, and got on with it. We hadn't changed really.
Well, the rest of the time was parades, Queen's birthday parade both years, 62, 63. Over to a place called Stonecastle, which I mentioned, which was where all the ranges were, which you did all your annual classifications. On the island itself, you couldn't do any training because it was so, everything was so restricted. I mean, all the barracks were cut into the side of the hill because ground was a priority. Nice barrack, but in the season it got very hot, very humid. Everything had to be left out because during the sort of humid thing, everything used to go mildew. Even boots, if they weren't taken out, used to go green. Clothing used to go green with the damp and things like that. Nice in the summer. Lots of strange things, snakes around. Because as I had the ammunition stores, I had all these. It was the old gun emplacements from the Second World War, which were facing, and all the ammunition was in the old gun under the hills. So if you undid the doors, you kicked the doors hard because you'd have the odd snake line along the inside the door, and they had pythons, cobras. I got not bitten, but I got hit one. I was doing COS, which was a company orderly sergeant. So after a night's duty, went home, changed into, and most of our dress out there was boots, socks rolled down, PT shorts, and a berry. And I was walking back from one place to the other, and as I walked along, I suddenly saw, we called them bamboo snakes, and it was a white-lipped pit viper, only a little thing, about 6 to a foot long. It was right in the path, and I can remember seeing it and jumping at the same time, and there was a wet patch on my boot where it had me. So it was a bit of a near miss, but there was quite a few snakes. You had to be sort of see where you were going, and especially around. And the other amusing thing we had, I think when they first came, we had CS gas, and we were practicing. They sealed this tent up on the square, and everybody had to test their respirator. And it went through, and anyway, everything went right. And we had one grenade that didn't go off. So being charged with ammo, I was given it. They said, go and get rid of it. And I took it down the back end where all this scrub was. And I went to see my W2, and I said, well, how much deck cord? He said, give it a 2.5 round of grenade. He said, collect it up with the wires to 233 deaths. He said, and blow it apart and release the gas. So I did what he told him. One half the grenade went 100 yards one way, and the other went another. We ended up with 2 companies of men with beaters and things trying to put all this scrub out the whole hillside, and Stanley Fort was on fire. So I went back to him, I said, you did say 1.5. He said, but I said, probably a little bit too much. So that was quite good. We did a lot of IS duties out there, internal security drills, box drills, with the banner, dispersal with fire and things like that. The other thing, although I wasn't in there and didn't take part myself because I was a headquarter company, they had Operation Seal when the Communist Chinese opened the border above Kowloon and let all the refugees through, and the whole northern territories were flooded with thousands of refugees. And our battalion and lots of the other people were all just mobilised, and their job was just go around, round up everybody they could who was, I know it sounds awkward, but anybody in the country they could find who looked a bit suspicious, and literally round up, slung them in the backs of 3-tonners, put them in barbed wire enclosures. Then the special branch and other people came down, went through them, and stuck them back over the border again, by the way. But whether it was a ploy to get lots of people into the border or just to bugger the border, the colony up, I don't know, but it was a big thing. That went on for some time. We had, the other big thing was water shortage. The thing, we had to convert everything to seawater, all the toilets on thing, because there was no water. You only had water every 3 days, standpipes. So all the prisoners had to go down to the sea, fill up all these things and fill up all the systems for the barracks to work for that. I was lucky enough to get the Bank of England guard, which was not a ball guard. It was one they locked you away for the night. So you had to ring up, get the password, go down by truck to the bank. You went inside, go down downside. There was a whole barrack room down there for a guard for about 15 people. Kitchen, bunks. The officer had a special panelled room which you had to wear blues in. And we always remember we had a guard with a rifle outside. This was inside the bank, downstairs. He had a rifle and bayonet. We sat on a table in the guard room. We had a box of ammunition. The box of ammunition had a padlocked on it, and the cupboard was padlocked, which we had to keep the key. So if anybody broke it, it would have taken hours to get the ammunition out. So it was all a bit of a nonsense, and they've stopped it now. So we did that. The other guards were Buckingham House and Clown's House and all the other ones. We did that for a few weeks. I say, then came August 69. We were on standby battalion again. Northern Ireland started. But I was lucky, nothing else happened from there. And we stayed out in Northern Ireland, again, only 4 months. We were home by Christmas, so we went out in August, July. Again, we had a platoon in a shop by the end of Craigavon Bridge. We had another platoon on the other side in something else. We had a platoon in an old carpet shop. We were spread all over London area, and they just did patrols and things like that. And it was just to keep the two sides apart. I mean, there was one instance where our blokes were on guard. There was the old wall, they were on guard. And from the bog side, the women used to come with a tray with teas for our blokes. And there was such a hoo-ha that we were favouring the Catholics that the women used to go down through another gate with a thermos flask and approach it from the waterside side. Of course, there was no protest because it was from the Protestant side. We had a saying there, be impartial, but if you see a Union Jack, duck. The bog side was all sealed off with lorries and balks of timber, but they were quite friendly in those days. It was just civil rights. I say we came back, the battalion got back, because it was only on a it was a bit like when we first went to Cyprus years ago. We were on a standby battalion, so we were a fill-in. Came back to Hobbs Barracks in Lingfield. Just Christmas, I then decided to leave, and I left the battalion in April 70. Brought myself out, having done 12 years, not 22.
This was the scene in Derry today as a new batch of British troops arrived to take over security duties at Bogside and other strategic points in the city. 300 members of the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Regiment, from Lingfield, Surrey, came ashore from the troop landing ship Sir Tristram at the Royal Naval Maintenance Base. They brought all their own equipment, jeeps, lorries and even their own bus. An advance party under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Millman had arrived earlier in the city. Another 125 troops are due in Belfast tomorrow aboard the normal sea ferry. This will bring the number of troops in the city of the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Regiment, to 500.
Left well by the left, quick back, left, right, 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 left.
You were still on the reserve then, presumably?
Oh yeah, I did 3 years and a bit, and come back, they put you on the reserve. All right, so come out there, got a job, just get settled into the job, and in the Eden decided he's going to declare war on NASA, didn't he? And what happens? In I go. Of course, I worked in offices all the time I've been in the army. Pay, MT, POL. What have I go? I go back into B Company again. I'm going to be B Company in the West Kents as in a platoon. Eh? The officer says, I understand you can type. Yeah, he said, would you like to work in the office? And I was being a bit bolshy. I said, no. So they said, oh, all right, then you can stop in the rifle companies. Shot myself in the foot. No, but I'd never had any training in the actual rifle offices because they have to do the radio and all. And I'd done a course, but I hadn't done any of that for donkey's years, you know. So I couldn't have done it anyway. So yeah, we went over there. We went on, did a lot of training, spent many a pleasant night under canvas down on Salisbury Plain, and walked in the dark. Nobody knew where we were going, but we got there in the end. And then we went over on, got on this train down in Dover, and come up on this troop train all the way up round Waterloo and all round there, down into Southampton. Got on this boat down there, and that was all, you know, tears, you know, tears and things. Oh, a dreadful old boat. And got out there, and then they shoved us in these assault boats and shoved us on the shore at Suez. And we had to march up. We went through the middle of Suez, one or two little heart-stopping moments when some fool let off a round. And we spent the night sleeping on a desk in a school in Suez, and then we marched on, got on a lorry and went up, and we took over from the airborne. There I met a chap up there who was an officer in the Queen's. It was me looking down in his trench, and he said, "I know you." I said, "Yeah." One scene never forgotten, so yeah. And I think his name was Fielding. Yeah, I'm pretty sure his name was Fielding. Anyway, they went up there, and of course we took over and they come back. We were stuck up there on the edge of the Suez Canal for 4 or 5 weeks, I suppose. We had the Foreign Legion up ahead of us, and we had the Israelis over the other side of the Suez Canal. And then the old Foreign Legion, they kill everything in sight because they, as far as whether it's true or not, I don't know, but they said that they only give them salt and wine. They have to live off the land, and they shot everything that moved. We kept a little goat that we tried to keep as a pet, you know, but I expect they had that in the end.
From there we went for retraining to Surrey, and then that is where I actually finished my training and qualified as a signaller, and then was posted to D Company as 11 Platoon signaller. There we were on various patrols. Notably, we were put to a platoon outpost in a village called Laying, which was alongside the railway, very exposed. The other side of the railway was rubber plantation, so we were very exposed to attack. So we had to be on our toes during darkness. But most of our patrolling there was in local areas. Then when we went back to the company base, we actually went on more regular patrols into sometimes deep jungle, sometimes just in the rubber.
What was the average length of a patrol?
About a week to 10 days, I suppose. Occasionally you would be in for a month, which would normally mean that you would need an airdrop for resupplying, which gave us a little how could I say, a little perk, in as much that if you had an airdrop, there was a lot of parachute silk that was around, and we used to allocate the parachute silk around the platoon, and that gave us something that we could wrap ourselves up in at night and keep ourselves fairly warm. And with the parachute silks, you usually found that people were very friendly to you when you were getting near to the mob because they wanted your parachute silk. It was also handy when you were laying in ambush positions to keep a little bit of extra warmth around you, because you could be in ambush position for 2-3 days, not moving very far, or not moving very much. You would have cold meals out of the tin, weren't allowed to smoke. Basically, it was only latrine that you could move for, go to the latrines.
How did you you feel about that, knowing there were people out there that might be trying to kill you as you were trying to kill them?
You didn't really think about it, and you were alert all the time, but you didn't really notice it. I only noticed when I came home how relieved I was and how I'd been living on my nerves. And it affected people different ways. I was very jumpy for quite a few months. And I did meet one chap who'd actually almost lost the power of speech. He couldn't talk without a terrible stutter. And yet in Malaya, he was as normal as anybody else. And it all had this effect, but you didn't notice it at the time. You were just alert. You were trained to be alert and watching for things, and the tension didn't actually get to you while you were there, or not to me anyway. I did have, being a signaller, I did have the added knowledge that if anything happened, that there would be 2 or 3 men that would actually be protecting me while I was doing my job. So I suppose that may have had an effect. But I haven't met anybody, even now, some 50 years later, where they said that they were on edge.
And what did you feel about when you heard you were going to Malaya, the other side of the world nearly, and travelling 50 years ago wasn't half as common as it is now?
The travel didn't actually affect me much. It did make me a little bit nervous because I can remember hearing on the radio every day they would give out how many forces of the forces have been killed, how many terrorists have been killed. This had been going on for a couple of years, and on the newscasts they used to do that daily. How many men have been killed? How many terrorists have been killed? So yes, I wasn't keen on it, but I'd signed up. So what could you do? You just go along with it. You didn't question things in those days. You were trained not to question. So I suppose we were led by the nose, really.
Did you ever run out of food on the patrols?
No, we were always well equipped. We took out a month's supply if we went out. Well, not a month's supply, but if we were going for a fortnight, we would take a fortnight's supply. And then we would know within a few days of the end of that fortnight that, we would need an airdrop. So then to do an airdrop, you have to clear the jungle. You have to chop down quite a lot of trees and make a nice open space so that I think it was the Hermes they used to come over with, knew exactly where we were. The biggest drawback with that is that you exposed your position to the communists, the terrorists. So as soon as the airdrop took place, you had to move very quickly, as far away as possible from that area. Most of the time in the jungle was very quiet. Everything was done in hand signals, whispers, and even with the radio, it was all in whispers. Sometimes that caused patrols to get lost. They would go past you within yards and wouldn't know when they were coming back off their fan patrols. They would come past, and I was on one patrol where a section did get lost for 2.5 days. But luckily we managed to find them with the help of the Oster aircraft. But basically that was because base camp was so quiet and the foliage is so dense that you can walk within 2 yards and not know you were there.
What about the wildlife and disease? Was that a problem at all?
The most problem we had was with a skin complaint called tinea, which, looking back, I think was a little bit like like ringworm. It came up in round blotches, and usually within the groins. But you would, when I got it once, it was slightly on the forehead, on the backs of my legs, and yes, and in the groin area as well. And if it wasn't treated, then it could spread quite a lot. That was the main problem. One or two chaps got malaria. Not many, because we were taking Paladin tablets and they were quite effective. Wildlife, I only ever saw one wild animal, and that was a baby elephant when I was on the latrine at the time, and so it was just as well. And a couple of snakes, and the scorpion was the main one you saw, which was very pleasant when you could hear scorpions about, because they could give you quite a big nip. But most of the wildlife was in the camps. We'd often have a snake come out. You'd be laying on, because you'd have in camp from 2 till 4 would be compulsory rest. And you'd be laying on your bed, and you would quite often have a small snake come out from under your pillow. Harmless things. But it was mainly in the camps that you saw anything. I can't say I saw a lot in the jungle. I couldn't tell you what we had. The only thing I can remember about our ration packs was one, that the milk chocolate was absolutely like white powder. And the other thing was that we had a self-heating tin that came out as a trial, and it was like soup, and you would light a fuse in the middle and it would go down and it would actually heat the soup up. And I can remember we were with, we had a couple of E-bands with us, which were native trackers from Sarawak in Borneo. And they were getting very agitated. And when they get agitated, they are, as I say, headhunters. You sort of get a little bit worried. And it turned out that they were trying to relight these tins, and it wouldn't work. And they were getting very uptight about it, because you had to. I mean, we had an incident when I was at that place called Laying, where a group of our boys, it was only a platoon, so it was a section that had gone out with a couple of these trackers, and they'd come across in the jungle some chaps fishing, and they thought that they were bandits, as we called them, and they went running down there and they chopped their heads off. And our boys just couldn't, stayed away, which caused and it turned out that they were villagers that were in an area where they shouldn't have been. And myself and another chap were on the gate when the funeral procession came through the gates, and it was a very tense time. We'd gone from being welcome in that village to being hated overnight. And basically, looking back, I don't think it was so much the fact that they were dead, it was the fact that they'd been decapitated, which caused most of the trouble. But yeah, I forgot to mention that camp, we also got attacked one night as well from the rubber. I was saying that it was very vulnerable.
Yes, did you?
Yeah.
They tried to get rid of you.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing while we were out there was that it was seek and destroy, hit and run from their point of view, seek and destroy as far as we were concerned. And it was, any skirmishes were over in seconds. Yeah, I mean, it was just a case of you spot each other, up comes the rifles, and bang, 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 and then away. or they were away. And a lot of them were actually dosed up on drugs as well.
Wow.
We had a case where the chap who got wounded in D Company, he'd actually got it in the arm, but then there was 2 or 3 bandits. He killed one, and the others had gone on and got into the jungle, but they put a burst of Bren after him, and whatever, everybody was shooting after him. And he was found a good 1,000 yards into the jungle, and he was riddled. And they reckon it was only the drugs he was on that just kept him running. They found his belt. His belt had been cut right off of him with bullets. They'd found that a long way back. And 1,000 yards in the jungle is pretty much like a mile outside. And they were dedicated blokes as well.
course, I was in the MT section for quite a while, and I eventually had my road test, or out and about, on any real roads, and I got to this little village, if you can call it a village, but it was very, very busy, and I had to go across this Cape Carney bridge, if you like, and there's a donkey on it, and he had this huge bale on his back, you know, and he could hear my engine behind him, waiting for him to cross, and he had other ideas. He was indignant, and he weren't going to have a noise of a vehicle behind him, so he started backing towards me, and then he lashed out at my truck with both back legs, and he hit the grill, but I mean, the truck are built like a tank, aren't they? So it didn't cause too much damage, but it upset me. I panicked, stalled the vehicle, couldn't get it started, failed my test. Well, when you fail, that's it, you go to a support company. You're a rifleman, or at best you hold a bazooka or something, and I didn't want that. But we had a very, very nice captain, Captain John Burgess, and he was a real family sort of person, you know, and he felt sorry for me because he thought, no, I should stay put, but rules are rules. But there was a way out. I liked painting. I used to paint all the number plates in Arabic. I used to paint the 55 symbol on the front and back of the trucks, and the 3rd Division sign, which was a red triangle surrounded by 3 triangles, making one big triangle. I think that was a pool of blood surrounded by the enemy. It's the 3rd Division. And I thought, right. And also all these vehicles were coming from Britain, but trial vehicles. And they're all in this horrible dark bottle green. And we're out in the desert, everything's buff colour. So he thought, I knew what Captain John Burgess was after. These trucks had to be painted. And so I had a second chance. And but before I had my second chance at taking the test again, we had to paint along with jankerwallers, you know, misdemeanors who were confined to barracks and that. And I was in charge, and they had to paint all these new trucks, and a horrible buff colour. I don't know if you know what a thunderbox is, but it's latrines where one digs a huge trench, and there's corrugated iron and timber around it, and that is for regimental toilets. And they've been there some time at this place. And there's an Arabic word called a ghibli, which is like a tornado in America, but it's nowhere near so severe, but severe enough, and it sucks up sand, and it becomes a sandstorm with a funnel. And it comes across the barracks, and we had just painted about a dozen green trucks, a sand colour. And this funnel of sand hit the latrines, ripped it out of the ground, sucked everything out of it, went straight across the vehicle park and plastered our newly painted trucks with all what was in this trench.
You were getting these vehicles into test?
Yes, and we had to go on this, yes, it was a Humber, and we had to take this Humber out. And it was a 1-ton Humber truck with a Rolls-Royce engine, heavily governed with little lead seals on the carburetors. But it was a beautiful thing, and still painted dark green. You know, it hadn't got the buff-coloured treatment yet. And we had to go to Port Said in it. So we left El Kabir, went to Port Said. And on the way there, we used to have these as you say, your compo ration.
Yeah.
You know, it would be a cake, Carson's chocolates, which was laxative, and boil sweets, and one or two other little goodies. And unfortunately, the Egyptians used to put their children, let the children get in your way to slow you down, to see what they can steal from the back of your trucks. You know, no disrespect for the Egyptians, but at that time, that was the norm. If they could get anything, I think they used to use the word bakshi. If there's anything that could be taken from the back of your truck, they would take baktish. That's it. Yeah, well, it's 50 years since I used the word, you know. And so the kids used to get in your way. You used to have to slow down. They used to clamour on your truck to see if there was anything. So what I used to do is to throw my compo ration out, and they used to love the chocolates. And bless them, you know, and they used to leave the road open for you to drive a little bit faster to stop them doing it. And of course, your co-driver used to do the same with these. Well, on the way back, you have a fresh supply of compo ration, but on the way back, we were in Malaya. And right at the wrong place at the wrong time, the truck broke down. And you know, you say you sweat, and I'm in the middle of Egypt, if you like, Malaya, on a very, very hot day, but my sweat wasn't hot. It was icy cold, and my tunic was sticking to me, and it was the same with my co-driver. And I said to him, well, there's nothing we can do. We've broken down. You know, what do we do? And of course, from nowhere, like a horde of flies, every youth in the city come around. You know, little ones, big ones, toughies, you know, they're all there pushing each other, who's going to be the first one. And then they would take a step and step back, and then somebody else would push somebody else forward. And then when somebody got brave enough, they all started to converge onto the truck. And I didn't know what was going to happen. But, I mean, all I had was 6 rounds, you know. And he had a Sten gun with 28 rounds. But what do? I mean, you don't know what to do other than panic. And then all of a sudden we heard these funny noises. Grunts, if you like. And the crowd stopped. And this very, very, he probably was only about 50, but he looked 100, this chap. He obviously was an elder. And he come and he couldn't talk. He could only grunt. And he come and he said, well, he couldn't say anything, just going, you know, and he was going like this for me to get out the cab. So I thought, well, I've got to get out the cab. So I got out the cab, walked to the front with him, and he banged the bonnet. And I thought, well, it's not rocket science. He wants me to lift the bonnet up. Whereas a trial vehicle, supposed to be secret, well, it's not going anywhere. It's broken down. So it goes back in the cab, and they had one of these luxury pull things, you know, which was new in those days, you know, to be able to operate the bonnet from inside the cab. So the bonnet sprung and he lifted it up. And there's this lovely Rolls-Royce engine. Now you could see him drooling over it, and with all these wire and lead seals on it. And he goes, well, you know. And of course we all carried a lovely leather toolkit, real leather toolbox, chrome spanners. I mean, this was luxury. So I thought, well, where is it? You know, I don't remember seeing one. So I looked around, and of course there was a container for it, and brings it out and gives it to him. And he's looking for cutters to cut the seals on the carburetors. So he cut the carburetors and the seals, and he's got the screwdriver and he's tweeting these twin Weber carburetors up. And I thought, what's he doing? And he goes, you know. So I goes in there and the thing springs into life and he's listening to it and he's tweeting away and the thing's purring. This big Rolls-Royce engine is absolutely purring. I thought, this man's a wizard. You know, he's got a tuner in his head. He knows everything there is to know about engines. And I'm lucky enough, or he found me, or I found him. So, I mean, there was nothing I could give him. You know, I thought, well, he's done it for us. So he goes like this, to all and the kids melted away. And a couple of them stayed behind, you know, and patted him on the back. And I said to one of them, who could speak English, I said, you know, what's it all about? And he said, you're the kind driver that throws his rations out the window for the children. So he fixed my truck on the strength of that. And I was absolutely amazed. Anyway, it was a lovely, lovely straight road coming out of Ismailia, going best way back to Tel Kabir. And I thought, I wonder what it can do. And for the first time in my life, I'd done over 100 miles an hour in a 1-ton truck. And we were absolutely amazed, and we couldn't tell anybody about it. Otherwise, I would have been on a charge. But I had to report the fact it had broken down, and a stranger who couldn't talk got it going again. Not only did he get it going again, he got it going 10 times better than it was. So that was amazing.
The Germans attacked at a place called El Aguila. The 7th Armoured Division, which had been the division that had done the advance, had been withdrawn because their tanks were getting a bit ropey. And they needed new tanks and a lot of maintenance. And a new armoured division had gone in, quite green. The division had been spread out over far too much of an area. And they took a hell of a beating, this division. But panic seemed to set in, and we didn't retreat, it was a rout. Everybody seemed to be rushing back as fast as they possibly could, without any attempt to stop, and nobody seemed to have got any control over anybody until we got well back, until control was restored. Now, I came back from Tobruk then. I came back towards Tobruk, and we came to a place called Tamimi. And I think this is the thing that stood out in my mind more than anything else. I'd become detached from my unit, and I got myself mixed up with Indian Division, because troops were getting all mixed up all over the place, and they hadn't established stragglers posts by that time. I found myself with the 4th Indian Division at Tamimi, and I thought, well, I'll stay here for a bit and see what's going to happen. And quite obviously, the 4th Indian were going to fight a rearguard action. And I'd never been in a rearguard action, so I thought, well, I'll stay there and study this. Now, at Tamimi, the escarpment comes from the sea at right angles to the coast. It comes inland. You can look down on the plain. That's towards where the German forces were. On the top of the escarpments, the Indians had got all their vehicles all dispersed, and the British artillery had come up to support the Indians with their 25-pounders. But there was nothing happening, nothing at all. The Indians, on the front of the escarpment, on the face of the escarpment, the Indians dug themselves in there, facing the plain. The 25-pounders were on the escarpment behind us. And I think it must have been, we stayed there all day, and it must have been in the middle of the afternoon when we suddenly heard sound of machine gun fire. And I could see on the plain down below either 2 or 3 British armoured cars, and they were coming back towards the escarpment, and I could see 2 or 3 German armoured cars going in the other direction. There was no aircraft over Tamimi that day. So obviously the armoured cars they'd been in contact, and they were doing a reconnaissance both sides, and they were coming back to report. Our armoured cars disappeared from my view, and everything still remained quiet until, I suppose, an hour later, maybe a bit more than that, suddenly 12 or 15 personnel carriers, German personnel carriers, appeared from across the plain towards us. And then they came so far and stopped, and then the infantry got out of the personnel carriers and started to move forwards towards the escarpment. At this point, the Indians opened up with their automatic weapons, and the Germans opened up with their automatic weapons, although they must have been about 800 yards away. And you could see the Germans making use of the ground. They were obviously very skilled soldiers. They were making use of the ground, the cover in the ground, the hillocks and the waddies, and moving forward towards the base at the foot of the escarpment. Then the 25-pounders started to fire from behind us. We could hear the shells coming overhead. It didn't seem to be doing any harm to anybody. And the Indian troops seemed to be, well, they were perfectly happy. You could hear them chattering away to each other and talking to each other. The face of the escarpment, of course, was all rock, and apart from bullets, the bullets were chipping the rock, and there was rock flying all over the place. Then the Germans started to use mortars. The first thing I knew about the mortars was suddenly there was a bump behind me, because the mortar bomb doesn't make a loud noise when it goes off, and a bit of smoke and a white patch. But our mortars hadn't got the range that German mortars had got, so the Indians didn't use mortars. They didn't open fire with the mortars because they couldn't reach the Germans. And they peppered the top of the escarpment with mortar bombs. They had no idea what they were trying to hit because they couldn't see anything, but they just fired off a lot of mortar bombs and a lot of machine gun fire. Our 25-pounders went mad, and this went on, I suppose, for best part of an hour and a half, and it was a very exciting business. The Indians were highly trained troops, there's no doubt about that, and the Germans were highly trained troops, all professional soldiers, all working to the book. Every move that was being made on both sides was the correct moves to make in the circumstances. Now and again a man was shot, and he was simply carried away and taken to the rear. And as it got towards dusk, the German fire seemed to slacken off a bit then, and when it got dark, obviously they retired, and the Indians, they eased off, and you could see their tracers then after dark. They eased off, and I think it was around between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night we got orders to. I didn't get any orders because I was a stranger there, but the Indians obviously got orders to move back, and they all joined the transport, and we all drove away back towards Tabuk.
Was it a frightening experience at all?
No, it was a very exhilarating experience. I found that all during the war. I found that any kind of action was exhilarating. I liked being in the army, and I liked being at war. And a lot of us did. I mean, nowadays people say, oh, it's a terrible thing, war. And it is a terrible thing. But if you're involved in it, some people enjoy it. And we were trained to do that job, and that's the job we were doing. No, it was an exhilarating experience, I found, all the time. All the time.
Did you speak to any of the officers of the 4th Indian Div?
Yes, but I don't know who they were. They were British officers. They were British officers.
Do they seem confident?
Oh, yes, yes. They're professional soldiers. They were regulars, yeah. Oh, yes.
Do you know the date of that rearguard action, approximately?
No, the date I can't say, but it must have been a month to 6 weeks after the advance.
What do you recollect of the rest of the retreat?
Well, we retreated from there to Tobruk. But Tobruk was held at that time. I came back then to Egypt and started to rebuild the overhead route I had previously built, which had been destroyed by that time. And that is the time when the danger arose from the German fighter aircraft, who flew along the route and became extremely dangerous to work in daytime, 28 feet up in the air. I think after that, as far as I was concerned, things were very quiet until the next advance, which was in November 1941. The British troops advanced, I think, and caught the Germans on the hop, although there had been a lot of fighting in between, but pushed them right back again. But simultaneously, or at exactly about the same time as the advance started, I think I would be around about Merzimatru somewhere, I was told I'd been promoted and had to report to Port Said to go to the Far East.